Recording in progress.
At this time, we'd like to call to order the Palo Alto City Council Rail Committee meeting for Tuesday, September 19th, 2023. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Chair Burt.
Here.
Councilmember Vinker.
Here.
Councilmember Lowing.
Here.
For the record, all present.
Thank you. So our first item is public comment for members of the public who wish to speak on any item that is within the purview of this committee, but is not on the agenda. And do we have any speakers?
Yes, we have one speaker, Eric Nordman.
Welcome.
Good afternoon. I'll keep this brief. Last meeting, I talked about the importance of understanding what the actual travel time is and what the number of property acquisitions really are. And since I don't think it would take much staff time to figure this out, and I'd like you to ask them to do that so that you can be properly informed. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll move on to updates on interagency activities. Oh, sorry. Oh.
Did you want to speak?
Yeah, for like 30 seconds.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and then fill that out later.
I'm just speaking for 30 seconds because
Turn on the mic.
The Churchill Avenue, I'm not sure if you're going to talk about the cost, but the closure with mitigations, which was option 2 from the XCAP, and they came out in favor of that. With the cost option was 50 million to 65 million. The partial underpass, which you've been talking about for this, I guess for I don't know how long this has been meeting, is estimated at 160 million to 200 million. So I just want to really emphasize that difference in cost. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll move on to verbal updates on interagency activities. And our first is regarding Caltrain. And Philip, did you have any updates?
Yeah, so just noting we don't have staff from Caltrain or VTA here today, but I'll be providing a staff update on everything that I have updates on. So just to start, I have a, let me mute the sound on my computer here. I have the Caltrain electrification process, I thought I muted, which is in the final phase of electrification. They're testing the new train set, and the new revenue service is expected to begin in fall of 2024. And there is a tour this Saturday, the 23rd, from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. at the San Francisco Caltrain station. So you can go tour the new train. Also, the Caltrain corridor study, the city and county staff have a meeting on the 20th of this month, tomorrow. Where we've been following up, staff have been following up with Caltrain on the forward tracking and the technical standards. And we're expecting to hear from them quite soon on these. I think the forward tracking they promised sometime in September, so we think it should be coming quite soon. But it wouldn't be surprising to hear from them on it in October. There's an LPMG meeting on September 28th at 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. And there's also the VTA ad hoc meeting on the 28th, I believe. Is it the same date? I think that's correct. No, it's not. It's the 29th. It's the following day, the 29th, and that's from 10 to 12 p.m.
And can I just make sure people understand? So the LPMG is the local policymaker group. It's this advisory group of one elected official from each city on the Caltrain corridor. And this VTA ad hoc is this grade separation ad hoc committee with representatives from Sunnyvale, Mount View, and Palo Alto. I actually won't be able to attend that, so I'm going to be looking for an alternate on that. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll be providing an update on the activities that we've been doing recently at that meeting. Thank you. Thanks for providing the full titles, not just the 4-letter acronyms in this case. The agreement with VTA, we're currently working with them on our existing cooperative agreement to include the Caltrain services for the early review of the conceptual plan and the associated study. It's just kind of internal information, but we're working with them to incorporate that into our cooperative agreement. On the Quiet Zone project, we're still working with the procurement department on acquiring the professional services for the consultant for the final design and permitting of the required improvements at the Palo Alto Avenue Quiet Zone. And we're also preparing to issue an RFP for a Quiet Zone study at the other locations in Palo Alto. And we're hoping to have the consultant on board before the end of the year to proceed with this work. And finally,
can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
Yeah, well, did you say other quiet zones? Is there more than one additional?
Yes. So
Oh,
it would be looking into this a study for quiet zones at the other crossings wherever
Okay.
there's an at-grade crossing currently.
Okay, thanks.
And just as a reminder, when we had a previous report on that, the quiet zone at Palo Alto Avenue really requires a minimal adjustment and low cost. Whereas at the other locations, they're much more involved and would be much more expensive.
Yeah, probably, but that's the purpose of the study. So we'll find out what the study recommends. But yeah, it's assumed that they'll be much more involved. And then finally, the San Francisco Creek emergency repairs, its ongoing coordination. Public Works and the Office of Transportation staff are continuing to coordinate with Caltrain staff, and the plans are currently at 100%, and the estimated total project cost is $5.3 million. Caltrain has hired the contractor to perform the restoration work, and it will begin in the next 2 to 4 weeks. And with that, happy to take any other comments, questions.
Well, if I just might follow up on 2 other things. One, Philip had mentioned we have this local policymaker group meeting, of which Councilmember Lowing is our city representative, and then I chair it as the Caltrain board representative. And I got we had a pre-meeting this morning and had the topic for this meeting is really the service schedule, or basically the train schedule for a year from now when electrification hits. And we've been waiting on this because ridership remains down. And as a result, the Caltrain had been pre-COVID essentially at peak hour at 5.5 trains an hour at University Avenue. We were one of the stations that had all the trains stopping there, and there needs to be a reduction in that service at peak hour because there's just not the demand. They have to actually go back to the FTA, I think it is, to get an approval because the funding that they had received from the feds for electrification was based upon their previous projection on service levels. But Caltrain is moving toward not only what they can do more efficiently with electrification, but also kind of a different ridership model where it's not so much peak commute. I mean, peak commute is still the highest boardings, but they're serving the rest of the day and the weekends. Bottom line is that we got to see the proposal, and I was worried that what we were expecting, which is more trains per hour at Cal Ave and San Antonio, might not come through. And instead, at peak hour, they're going to have 4 trains an hour at University, 3 trains an hour at San Antonio and Cal Ave, and at peak hours. And then throughout the day, from 5:30 in the morning until 1 at night, apparently, it's 2 trains an hour. And so it's not just a kind of a commuter line going forward. And so I think that's really good news for the system and for Palo Alto. And then I just did want to mention one other thing that came out of the last Caltrain board meeting is that Caltrain's moving a lot more toward revenue from passes. And one of the things that they are looking to doing is very steep discounts for their Go passes for all affordable housing residents. And so that may be something that we're going to want to look at, how we work with our affordable housing providers and really get transit passes in the hands of residents in our affordable housing projects. So 2 real positive developments I just want to share.
Can I just confirm?
Yeah.
It sounds terrific. Both things. The 2 trains per hour off peak are also at San Antonio and Cal Ave.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's great. And yeah, I just saw an email yesterday from Caltrain promoting passes for like non-commuters, for family passes or 3-day passes if you're part-time work. So it looks like a lot of creativity is happening. It's good.
Yeah, that was what I alluded to in the council meeting before this last one, which is they also have a whole new set of kind of different types of passes. So to try and meet people's needs, if you're no longer commuting 5 days a week, what's a pass that suits your need? And they're going to monitor which of these alternative programs works well, and then figure out what their long-term approach is. But they're responding to kind of the new ridership patterns, and really how do they regain the former ridership, given that we're going to have some form of hybrid work long term. And what's happened throughout the area is that fixed rail systems are still down drastically in ridership. Caltrain is back up almost to 40%. Which is an improvement. But between BART, Caltrain, and even at VTA, we have bus ridership is 90% of pre-pandemic. Light rail is 50%. So all the fixed rail folks that are basically serving office workers as their probably biggest portion of riders are recognizing that not only do we have a near-term, somewhat downturn in the tech economy, but more importantly, just the hybrid work is really influencing that demand. Not to mention that when the freeways are not severely crowded, people who could choose to drive or take a train are still driving. And then there's a certain tipping point at which folks go, no, it's no longer worth it. Congestion's gotten bad. I'm going to get back on the train. Long-term, we're going to have less people going in to work 5 days a week, and not the populated. State Department of Finance is not projecting real significant population growth for our area. And so I've been arguing to both Caltrain and VTA boards that we really need to adopt programs that are going to support ridership really through passes and get people to have mode shift. Because they have a pass, they will then use the service. And we have a living example right before us, Alice, who had shared with me, and I shared with the VTA board, that she said that one of the reasons she tell me if I get this wrong, but one of the reasons she took her position with our city is because Palo Alto provides Caltrain Go passes for all of our workers downtown, and that was a key factor. And so oh yeah, so the other thing that's right, and everybody at the Caltrain board said, wow, that's a great story. And not to mention that her boyfriend gets off at San Antonio and then rides his bike out to Fabian Way. So it's a perfect model. And I would just say that the other thing that Caltrain is doing, I realize that Palo Alto has the second highest boardings in the system. And that's not just by happenstance. It's really because of over 2 decades of a series of programs that we've had that drove ridership in direct things like the Stanford General Use Permit that capped their peak hour trips to car trips to campus, to the Stanford Hospital where they actually had to buy go passes for all the employees at both hospitals, to our downtown TMA, and then to what we've done as a city government supplying passes. And those kinds of development agreements and conditions of approval all make up a package. We did it really not to drive Caltrain ridership, but to reduce our traffic congestion, reduce our parking demand, reduce our pollution, greenhouse gases, and otherwise. But the result has been that we have the second highest boardings in the system. Long story short, Caltrain is wrapping up what they're calling a toolkit for cities that looks at all this range of programs that cities can adopt. And then we're going to try and get cities to kind of say, in principle, we're going to start taking on these sorts of programs as it seems most appropriate for our city. And basically inducing ridership through that means, I think, is going to be critical for restoring ridership. And if there's not ridership, we don't have the service level. So you can have that same sort of doom loop that you start cutting back service because there aren't riders, and you get fewer riders, cut service more. So we've really got to be proactive if we believe in transit and a thriving transit in our region. And the Palo Alto's model is basically the framework that they're adopting. And so we should be proud of what we did over time. Long version, but a lot of updates. Okay. Philip, next you have VTA?
No, sorry, that was all of it together.
All of 3?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Got it. And I don't think there's really a lot on VTA rail related other than what Philip already spoke about of this upcoming meeting. And again, the date is of the ad hoc date and time. So everybody
It is the 29th, September 29th, Friday, September 29th, I believe at 10 a.m. I'm gonna have to pull my notes back open. But I believe it's 10 a.m.
Okay, thank you. And that would be on the VTA website. You can log in, or if anybody wants to go in person, they can, but less so these days. All right. Thank you for those updates. And then we have our action item, first action item, which is a discussion of new grant awards and requirements for grants from the Federal Rail Administration and the California State Transportation Agency for grade separation project and projects, and to direct staff to develop funding agreements. This item was continued from our last meeting. Philip.
All right, thank you very much. Do you mind just pulling up the slideshow? And I think it's slide 6, just to set the stage. As the chair mentioned, this item was continued, so I won't go over the whole entire PowerPoint again, but just to start again on the 6, just to refresh, the reason we're coming back today is to talk about the schedule. And there was a request for us to figure out how we can fit everything in. And so that's what we're trying to do today. So this is just a reminder. This is what the schedule looks like. Can you go to the next slide? So this next slide is an attempt for us to figure out how to fit all of the additional studies that we believe would be helpful in evaluating the additional grade selection evaluation criteria. And so this is the proposal that we have in order to move this forward in an expedited manner. This list of studies would all be completed within 4 to 6 months. So it would fit within the time frame that we need to achieve in order to make a decision, noting that there's all these pieces that we need to fit together. This is a puzzle. We need all the pieces to fit together in a timely fashion. But I'll go over each one of these just really briefly. The first one is the east and west connectivity. And just a reminder, each one of these is a new item that was added as the evaluation criteria, or revised, I should say, or added in the evaluation criteria. So east-west connectivity. So this would expand upon the prior traffic analysis that was done, and provide an analysis of bicycle data, and determine if any of the grade separation alternatives are more favorable than others in terms of the circuitous nature of the pedestrian and bicycle routes. The next one is traffic congestion, and this one would conduct a traffic analyses to evaluate the east-west travel times and determine if any of the alternatives are more favorable. It would also include a determination if any of the alternatives induce traffic in other areas of the city or create more congestion on alternate routes. Next one is pedestrian and bicycle circulation. This one specifically would evaluate the travel times and safety of pedestrian and bicycle routes during and after construction to determine if any of the alternatives are more favorable in this regard. And routes that eliminate conflicts with motor vehicles will be seen as more favorably than, say, routes which force peds and bikes through traffic, highly congested traffic corridors and or intersections. The next one is cost, and the study would evaluate and summarize the cost for each alternative to determine which alternatives are more favorable in this regard. In addition to construction costs, it would include property acquisitions, easements, and relocation assistance, utility relocations, any costs associated with long-term maintenance, such as pump stations, and just an overall funding feasibility. So alternatives that carry a high cost and cannot be phased into smaller, more fundable segments would be seen as less favorable. And finally, I'm sorry, not finally, but the next one is private property impacts. And the study would evaluate each alternative in terms of its impact on private properties. And the impacts to be considered will include temporary easements and acquisitions, either partial or full. And it will also include the indirect impacts to properties that could affect qualities of life, like tree removal or removal of frontage of property, and any privacy concerns. As an example, like an elevated train that maybe could see into someone's backyard. The next one is environmental impacts. And that study would evaluate environmental impacts to determine if any of the alternatives are more favorable regarding rail noise and vibration, which we'll be discussing later today, sea level rise susceptibility, and sustainability, the heat island effect, collection of and treatment of stormwater. And the next one is, I'm sorry, am I going in the right order? Yeah, visual impacts. And this one will perform a shadow analysis for the three elevated rail alternatives. And it would include modeling of the existing trees to determine the plan view footprint of new shadows created by the elevated rail structure. And it will also determine if there are any potential mitigation measures for the elevated rail alternatives to reduce privacy concerns of nearby residential properties. And just also to note that these will not be like really in-depth studies. So these will be more high-level studies. Some of these things would typically be studied at a later phase, and so this will be an early look at some of these things. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. As I mentioned before, we're continuing this item. This is the additional context about how we can fit the studies into the time frame. So with that, happy to turn it back to the committee.
And thank you for that. It's brings it back a bit. Yeah, I have a question about the first and third studies, the east-west connectivity and the pedestrian and bicycle circulation. And thanks for describing those, because I had wondered when I looked at the report, in what respect were they distinct? And I think you described that the first one is looking at the like circuitous, the actual path, and the other one is avoiding sort of interaction with cars, to oversimplify it. Is that accurate? Is there any way those can be combined to be studied together, or?
Yeah, well, so yes, they actually won't be considered completely separately, but the reason that they're listed separately is because those are separate evaluation criteria that were identified. So they could have slightly different impacts that would be identified in the evaluation criteria.
I see.
But yes, you more or less described them accurately.
Okay, thank
And
you.
they do have a lot of overlap.
Okay, great. And then is there anywhere that sort of the potential aesthetics of the train fit in? I can't remember exactly how we described our criterion, if they do, but of the different options, because visual impacts is a little different, I think, with the shadows and the trees. But is there any place that fits, or is that just a later stage conversation?
Yeah, I think visual impacts is the only thing that we really have, identified here. That said, as alternatives are selected to move forward, the emphasis can be put on, creating a visually, if for instance you select a certain alternative, staff and consultant, and when we put out an RFP or we coordinate with Caltrain on the moving forward the project, we can put that as our goal, to make sure that it's aesthetically pleasing. And we can talk about what the components of an aesthetically pleasing grade separation would be.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great, because I think, at the end of the day, that's what people see. I mean, all of this other stuff has to be right, and it's critical, and it's the priority. But just wanted to make sure we're going to have that factored in. And so then just on the timing, I know you said 4 to 6 months, which if it's 6 gets us pretty close to that April 1 magic date. Do you think out loud a little more about how that would interplay with going to council and all of that? Because getting on the agenda and all that takes some time.
Yeah, I think we'd be really hopeful that we're closer to that 4-month time frame, and I do think a little bit over 4 months is reasonable. So I think that we will be able to fit it into the time frame. The only reason we're allowing a little more room is what were to happen if we continue discussing this item today, we decide we want to go in a different route. So I think that's a little bit of extra room, but I think that we should be able to have this information back in enough time for us to deliberate and to take something to council.
That's great. That's what I was hoping you would answer. My little marginal note was, let's aim for 4. So you are. Thank you. That's all I have.
Yes, overall, this $109,000 price seems like a good value to me. And not to mention that it's already budgeted in the contract. I'm especially surprised at the relatively low cost of all the traffic studies at only $21,000 now. You've warned us that we're not going to get down to each car level on something like that. But this is a lot of information for that price point. That said, should we go deeper on any of these to more better inform us, or are you comfortable with what we're going to get for the 109?
Yeah. Well, I will say that just to note on the traffic study, a lot of work's already been done on the traffic study, so this would augment the traffic study. So this would be more of like supplement, and a lot of this is supplements to things that have already been done, and we feel like we need more detail.
Okay, good clarification.
So yes, to answer your question, this is going to be a little bit. I mean, the reality is, if we want something more in depth, it's going to take more time than we have. A lot of these things are really looked at more in depth in the next phase of the project. I mean, a lot of these things are really more commonly done in the environmental phase. So just noting that we're taking an early look, and sometimes you don't have all the information to get more detailed at this phase of the project.
Yeah, so there will be, if not overlap, further elaboration in each of these areas.
Yeah, that's correct.
So your reference to the environment was exactly my next question. Remind me how deep we have to go at each one of these intersections. Is it a full EIR kind of thing?
Yes, in the next phase.
Yeah, in the next phase at
Yes.
each location, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
So just following up on Ed's comments on that 409,000, it's hard to kind of envision how much we'll get for what is comparatively a small amount of money for a lot of studies. And I'm trying to anticipate that after so many years where we've been looking at alternatives, we're going to be able to come to a decision with a council that is, 3 of the members have just this year started wading into this, and yet we're going to need to come to a decision within 6 months. That's ambitious. I'm not sanguine about being able to get to that point. But I think what we're really looking at is we would then have a decision point. Is that correct? That if we can't arrive at a decision yet, we would have to look at what we do on the grants. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah,
that's
okay.
And I'm sorry, just to provide, I think that there was some clarification. The EIR, I think, is potentially statutorily exempt on grade separation projects. If
that's true.
Sure.
But there will be environmental studies that need to be completed in the environmental phase.
But not a full EIR?
By law.
That's correct. So Kyle Ariano, Assistant City Attorney. The CEQA does contain statutory exemptions for grade separation projects specifically. And so those are very useful, for example, in keeping things moving, executing these agreements, grant funding, things along those lines. But of course, when it comes to the final or actual selection of a specific alternative, agencies oftentimes do undertake their own environmental review, even though it's not statutorily required, just to make sure that for their community and for their stakeholders, they're fully informed on that decision.
Yeah, thanks for that reminder. So a couple other questions. First, on the traffic, we have this odd circumstance where we had done these prior reports pre-COVID, and we're in a different era. What are we going to? How will we be able to update traffic with the kind of the prior conditions no longer exist? The future is difficult to predict. How are we going to kind of update the traffic reports in some way that'll help us make decisions?
I'm just checking to see if I can actually have our consultant come on to this.
And I guess related to that, we've talked about there are a couple of tools. There was already streetlight data, and now there's this other one that is, what's it called again? Begins with an R. That I think MTC is using, and others, and they like it even better. And I don't know whether those tools would be part of what we would use at this time, in part because they can give us great information on the current traffic patterns, but I'm not sure how useful that is.
Yeah, so the new tool is called Replica. And just to note, we're also going to be piloting using that tool as well. Yeah, so there are a lot more tools available for traffic data than there were just even a year ago. So yeah, there's a lot more information that can be available without going out and sitting and physically counting cars. So I will say that there's a lot more data available now.
But given that the number of cars we have today isn't particularly valuable in terms of projecting what our future impacts will be, how do we contend with that?
Yeah, I think That's something we can discuss with our traffic consultant, which is Hexagon, and they're dealing with this in their locations as well, so they might have some good information to help us understand that.
Okay. And then on the bicycle and pedestrian issues, we have a lot of, I don't know if it's fair to call them nuances, but a lot of specific design issues that remain to be resolved to really make some of these alternatives work well. And I'm not assuming that we're going to be able to resolve those in this through this set of consulting studies. So it seems that we may be in a place where we need to select our local preferred alternative or alternatives without having really resolved some issues that a lot of the community will say, I still have a concern with this. And I'm not sure what the solution is to that dilemma. Do you have any thoughts on that or insights?
Well, I think I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on which of those elements are the ones that wouldn't be resolved. And I'm not disagreeing with you, but I just think this in particular is a way of answering the different, or adding filling in the blanks for the criteria and giving us more information. But I'd like to hear which specific bicycle design
well,
features.
for instance, the Meadow in Charleston, my understanding is that they're, with the our bike advisory group payback at a number of concerns on and safe routes to school folks. And I'm not at all sure that some 1/6 or 1/7 of $109,000 by a company that does a lot of kind of engineering work, when we give them a specific design that we're looking for, versus somebody who's going to wade in and do the problem solving, working with the community really and to a good degree to figure out, are there creative solutions to overcome some of the issues that exist with the current designs. And I don't see that as likely feasible in this time frame with this budget and with these consultants. I don't think that's what they've shown us is really their greatest strength. They did strong work in specific designs, but kind of not this.
Well, yeah, I think you're correct in that. I think what I'm hearing would require a complete redesign of the alternatives in order to accommodate those things. And
I don't know if it's complete redesign, but
because
certainly
really what we
tweaking.
have in this contract is not redoing any of the designs. This is an evaluation of the designs that currently exist. So this would be looking at the current designs and evaluating the bicycle circulation, the pedestrian circulation, evaluating travel times, to understand that. This is not changing the alternatives. This is working within the alternatives that exist. If we wanted to say, hey, we'd like to, I don't know what, if we've got too steep a path here for bicycle and pedestrian as an example, that's something that we could put into our scope as we develop into the next phase, is that we want to figure out how to make this the bicycle and pedestrian path more feasible. And some of those things are the things that we'll find in this evaluation. That would be like, a roadblock that, or just to say not necessarily circuitous nature, but something that makes it more difficult for someone to travel across the corridor. So those are the things that would be evaluated. So then we'd understand X alternative has a challenge for bicycle and pedestrians that needs to be looked at.
Okay, that's a helpful clarification. That we're not going to look at refining designs. I can anticipate, though, that we could have a difficult decision as a council because we have community pushback on a given design that is maybe a problem that's solvable, but we won't be able to have the opportunity to, have solved it before we have to make the decision. And so the choice could be, nope, we're going to select another alternative because this problem hasn't been solved. Or we have just faith that it will get solved adequately and we're going to go ahead and make a big decision and maybe it can't be solved. And I'm not sure how to overcome that dilemma, but I think we need to be open that that's potentially what we're going to face.
More than faith and experiences.
Yeah. And I don't know if anybody has any further thoughts on that. I'm just struggling with it now that with that clarification that there won't be at this point in time. It makes sense for this amount of money that there's not going to be refinements to design. That makes sense. I'm not disputing that. I'm just thinking forward on what we might be facing.
Well, and if the decision before us today is, do we go forward with these? I mean, we can, after we see them, we can see if we have those hurdles and we're uncomfortable, putting those applications in. I mean, I don't think this will be wasteful. It's not hugely expensive. It'll be informative regardless. And, if we have that circumstance, we can.
Well, we have them. Some of those issues exist right now. They're known.
Right, but okay. And I thought we were talking about if more come up or if.
No, I think it's mostly, I mean, there could be others that come up, but I think it's mostly that it's that there are unresolved issues as we stand today.
So are you saying that we're in as good a position today as we would be then to pull the plug on some of those or on this?
No,
or?
I'm just saying that it seems likely to me that we will get to the point where we have to make a decision on a local preferred alternative, and there are things that have not been resolved in designs that are maybe solvable, but we won't have solved them, and we'll have a dilemma of whether we tell the community we're going to go forward with an alternative that as of right now has X problems. We think we may be able to address them in the future, but we don't have those answers at this point in time, and yet we're going to make a big decision. And I think we just need to recognize that that's probably what we're going to be facing. And if we have ideas on how we might address that, I'm all ears, but I'm not sure that there's anything we can do.
Yeah, if I can, I just want to note that, we recently did refine the underpass alternatives, as was council direction, rail committee's direction, with input through the pedestrian and bicycle advisory committee and others. But I do want to note that the pedestrian and bicycle advisory committee, and I shouldn't say necessarily the whole committee, but advocated for the viaduct as an alternative. So we'll just note that that even though the viaduct was removed by council, that was advocated by a lot of our pedestrian and bicycle community. So I'm saying that because that was also the least popular alternative in the community when we did our surveys.
That's right.
I just want to kind of emphasize that there's not necessarily an alternative or a decision or anything that is going to make everyone happy. So I just want to kind of emphasize that point, that I think there are going to be tough decisions that need to be made for this project to ever move forward.
Well, and that's a really good example, because we had some of the council members who have said they wanted to relook at the viaduct. We as a committee referred that back to the council, but I don't see any way that we're going to be able to have that full in-depth analysis of viaduct folded into this process. So we basically had said before we got these grants as opportunities, we were saying we were at least going to give another look at the viaduct for Meadow and Charleston, if I recall. That was the referral, right? We didn't say we were going to look at it again for Churchill. But how does that fit in now with this timeline for decisions? I don't get how we could re-examine that. But that was a referral to the council.
I'm sorry, how we would re-examine the viaduct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so currently as that stands, Caltrain is going to evaluate that alternative. So I think we'll be getting some feedback from Caltrain if the rail committee decides that they want to I guess ask council to reconsider it. I think that's the rail committee's prerogative at that.
Do you have
time.
a sense of when Caltrain would provide that?
No, I'm still working with Caltrain on their schedule.
Yeah.
I should add though, just really, it's critical to this conversation is that Caltrain has been with us in our discussions regarding these grants with the grantee, with the grantor, I should say, and has been involved in all the meetings and the planning and the scheduling and all of that. So they are well aware of our schedule and also our needs in order to make a decision.
That's great, because that was one of my other questions is, they have a lot, their technical team who's working with us on giving technical answers to our grade separation issues and design improvements, whether it's vertical grade and vertical curve or construction methods or bridge deck thickness, all things that can make an alternative less disruptive to build, lower cost, fewer impacts. Those are big things. They've added capacity in the last year. They have a whole team there, and yet their plate is pretty full. And that's part of why we don't have answers already on some of these key questions. So are they going to have the capacity? I have two capacity questions. Do we internally have capacity first for what we're doing the next few months? And then do we need more capacity if we take these grants and start ramping up? Do we have adequate internal capacity? And does Caltrain have adequate capacity to meet kind of the timelines that are being required?
Thank you for that question. So yes, this is all really critical. So I appreciate these questions. First, Caltrain, at least thus far, is really collaborative on this and definitely has the same goal as us if we proceed with this in meeting grant deadlines and delivering the project. So we'll say that. We're still working with them and the grantor on the schedule. Internally, I will say that I believe it's going to be a challenge for us to deliver, and we are going to need some assistance, which potentially could come in the form of consultant or contract help, or we might need additional staff help. Something we still need to figure out as we move along here. But we will figure out how to if we decide we're going to proceed with it.
Okay, thanks. And then we have these deadlines. Are we sure that these deadlines are hard and fast, or are they appealable?
They're not. So I would say they're not appealable. They're not hard and fast yet. So they're not set yet, but we think they roughly will fall within this. The one that we do have, which is a hard deadline, is actually for the second grant. So if you'll remember, we have a grant for $6 million from the Federal Railroad Administration. The second grant we have is from CalSTA. And that one, all project work needs to be completed by June of 2027. So that one, we've got a hard deadline. The challenge is if you don't do the first one, then you can't do the second one. So because we have a grant for the preliminary engineering and environmental, then we have one for final design. So we need to complete the preliminary engineering and environmental for Churchill specifically before we can move to final design for Churchill for that second grant, which is the $23.7 million grant.
Okay. Vicki?
Yeah, I think you just answered in by looking at slide 2 or 3. I was going to ask about, given that the different crossings have different issues in terms of the viaduct and other things that Pat mentioned, can we put in a grant on some or all? But now I'm looking at it and I see the federal one is the preliminary, and the CalSTA, is it just for Churchill?
Yeah, that's correct. It currently now we are still in discussion with them to see if there might be they might be amenable to us modifying it. But noting we applied with Charleston Meadow as our priority and Churchill as our third priority, and we were awarded for Churchill. So just so Churchill. So we were only awarded for Churchill final design.
And is that because we had selected a locally preferred alternative for Churchill and we had not for Charleston East Meadow?
I believe so.
And then for Charleston East Meadow is the one that the Department of Transportation is directed to. So it could be that we come to April and decide we can move forward on some and not on others because of the issues that the chair has identified. So, you know, in terms of unresolved design issues or things. I don't know. I mean, net, I think we still go forward with these studies you've outlined, given the cost and the benefit. But yeah, we may end up in a tricky spot, but it does seem like the different grants have different decision matrices, so to speak. So, all right, thank you.
See, I'm sorry, I didn't go to the public yet, did I?
We do not have any requests to
Okay,
speak.
thanks.
Do we need procedurally to recommend this to council and put it on consent, or because it's the same contract, we don't have to?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, we do not, unless there's a concern here. We can do this within our existing contract, so we don't need anything other than just nodding your heads and everybody in agreement that we want to do this. We don't need any formal action in order to do this. This is within our existing. This fits within our existing scope and our existing budget, so we don't need any additional authority to do this.
So let's just well, yes,
I'm
Alice.
so sorry. We do have a couple of requests to
Great.
speak now that we
Okay,
mentioned it.
good.
All right. Our first request to speak will be Steve Rosenblum.
Good afternoon, council members. Steve Rosenblum, resident of Old Palo Alto. Yeah, I think this is a really important discussion. And I think what this last part of it recalls the tenor of the discussion in the last rail committee meeting, which is, are these grants going to force our hand in decision making? And I think that's really an important question, because we don't want to be forced into making a quick decision on a project that's going to have long-lasting effects on the community. And I think your concerns, especially Councilmember Burt, that voiced about the unresolved issues. If we make a decision about these things with unresolved major concerns, we might regret making that decision. So I think I would really caution people, particularly about taking the grant from CALSA, because to me, the decision on Churchill needs to be reopened to the possibility of a viaduct. And I think once the discussion of the viaduct at East Meadow and Charleston is brought to the table, I think it will become clear what the advantages are, and it will make the discussion of a viaduct at Churchill much clearer, especially with regard to connectivity issues. I think also with respect to what Phil has brought up about the studies, I think the study about bicycle and ped access should be broadened to safety in general, maybe adding safety as a part of the title, because I think unauthorized access to the rail bed should be part of the concerns. So to make sure that that safety of the community, not just for bicycle and pedestrians, but for willful trespass and such issues, is also properly accounted for. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Winter Dellenbach.
Hi, I have two or three things. One, I wanted to talk about the chart that you showed in the presentation with the various, in which I was really glad to see the various things that need to be studied in more depth. And about that, I do have a couple of things. One is that while it would be obviously intermittent, the rail cars have height also. So the sound wall comes about approximately, it seems, halfway up to a rail car. And then above that is the rest of the rail car. I checked many years ago. I went to every community meeting with the exception of one that concerned Charleston and East Meadow, and participated. And I have all my handouts from them. And I went to a couple Caltrain meetings. So I was pretty, into this before COVID. And so the rail cars I asked back then at one of these meetings, and they're about 12 feet tall, approximately 12 feet tall, as far as I could figure. And so you have another 6 feet above, at least when the trains are going by, added on to the height. So with a hybrid, it'd be 27 feet, and with a viaduct, 32 feet. Now, that's not counting the overhead contact systems. But I just wanted to add that in, that intermittently, you're going to have 6 more feet up there in height. Two other things I want to say. I was told by somebody that's very much an authority on this subject all along, and I'm not going to name who that is, that the freight train carries such a heavy load, and we saw in the charts about 50 cars are thought of. It's so heavy that the viaduct it has to be a berm viaduct. It can't have cut-throughs, cutouts, cut-throughs, columns, whatever you want to call them, supports. It has to be a solid berm because of the weight of the freight train. And I would love if that could just be I'd love to know if that is still the case. And then finally, in November 28th of 2018, I was at a community meeting at Mitchell Park with all of the experts there and the consultants, and the sound guy was there. And I had a private talk with him, and he said that with the viaduct, you'd put the sound walls up, but it would really bounce the noise. And he said significantly bounce the noise further away than the immediate properties that the viaduct would be going by and overlooking. I just wanted to throw those things in. Thank you for listening. Please consider what I said.
Our next speaker is Bruce Arthur. Bruce, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you. I just want to speak regarding the undercrossings at Meadow and Charleston. And as Councilmember Burt pointed out, I'm on the bicycle advisory committee, and I think that plan is bad enough for bikes and pedestrians that we shouldn't do any more studies on it. I think we know that it's bad. I think that plan can be fixed if we had bike lanes and sidewalks to both sides of Charleston and Meadow. But I know that people are concerned that that's going to make the weights for cars better. And I do want to say that I think the safety of bikes and pedestrians should be more important than the delays, the small marginal delays for cars. So I'm a little reluctant to spend more money studying that plan, since as we already know, there's some serious problems with it. I think it's fixable. I think these things are all fixable, but like charging ahead with this plan is ultimately going to leave us with a result that isn't a viable or isn't a good option. And I don't know why we would do that. So thank you.
And our last request to speak is Carrie Yarkin.
Okay, this is another 30 seconds. Okay, in advocating for the Churchill closure plus mitigations, if you subtract the $30 million that you're going to get from the, I guess it's from the federal CalSTA, so you'd have 50 million minus 30 million, $20 million is all that we would be paying. That's the lowest cost, but $20 million is all the city of Palo Alto would have to owe to get that whole intersection grade separated. You've got the bikes, you've got many different things. And I don't know if you're looking at that option 2, which was adopted by city council, as the second option if the partial underpass doesn't work. Okay, the partial underpass, so you're looking at $160 million minus 30 million is $130 million. Okay, that difference in cost is $110 million. I don't know, that is a ton of money when it can be done on basically on the cheap. I mean, it's still $20 million the city has to find somewhere or pay, but that's a big cost differential. Thank you.
All right, that concludes our public speakers. Just to share a couple responses that were requested. So one of the things at the last LPMG meeting, we had a really informative presentation on all the basic design alternatives, and the viaduct non-berm, but the viaduct on pillars is established by Caltrain as able to handle both passenger and freight cars. One of the other things I'll just note that came up there, which was different from what we had back 2 years ago when we looked at the hybrid versus what we were calling the viaduct, is the Caltrain made a distinction, said, look, you can do a hybrid, meaning partially elevated on pillars, and you can do a full viaduct on pillars. You can do a berm hybrid. You can do a full elevation berm. The construction method of a berm versus pillars is not linked to whether it is partially elevated, as in a hybrid, or fully elevated, as in what we were calling the viaduct. That's a construction method, and then how high you go and whether you're a hybrid is a separate issue. But both construction methods are doable for both those variations, the hybrid or the what we've been calling the viaduct. So on that note, we're about ready to kind of straw poll. Are we supportive of staff going forward with the proposal that they have here, which, as Philip pointed out, does not actually require any official action, but good.
Yes.
Good. 3 heads nodding. Okay. That's very good. And so that concludes item number 1. Our next item is a study session on a discussion of the noise and vibration comparative analysis report going back to July. It was done in July 2020. And what we want to do was revisit that and look at that. And Philip, was this really also in the context of some of the concerns that were raised at the time over assumptions of noise and vibration impacts of viaducts?
Yes, that's correct. And also I just want to note that we have our consultant, Paul Burge, on the line, as well as Peter DiStefano, but I believe Paul Burge will be making this presentation.
Great.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Paul. Welcome.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I was told someone else would probably be actually turning the pages on the PowerPoint presentation. Is that correct?
Yeah, we'll get that for you.
Okay.
Just
You mean comments? You mean comments? Yeah. Probably the chair wants to do the staff presentation first.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead. Okay, we got the title page. And why don't we go to the first slide? Okay, Paul, you can just tell us when you want to move to the next slide and we'll do so.
All right, sure. Just a little overview. We were asked to do this, and it was mentioned this was originally, this report was originally presented about 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago. And the idea here was to try to do a comparative analysis of the different alternatives at the time for some of these grade separation techniques. It's important to understand that this did not include anything besides noise vibration. We did not consider cost. We did not consider safety. We did not consider traffic, anything like that. It's strictly, how we thought each one of these alternatives were represented in terms of how it would either increase or decrease noise or vibration associated with each alternative. All right, so the first thing we're looking at here, we have a few slides to just kind of summarize graphically what the different alternatives were. So this one here is kind of the existing conditions. So you have the rail line, and these are generally, I think, if you were looking north. So you have the 2-track line there in the middle of the corridor. And if this were a grade crossing going through, you'd have the sawbucks there. For most of the alignment, have Alma Street there to the east, and then you would have homes, first and second row homes on either side. To the west, the second row homes, the first row homes are mostly the backyard would be facing the rail alignment, and the second row homes would be on the other side of the street. And on the east side, I believe for most of the alignment, the first row homes would be facing the roadway, the access onto Alma Street, and the second row homes would be the backyards of the homes on the next street. And the dimensioning here, these are all kind of typical. They change as you go through the corridor, but we'll try to kind of update that as we go from one alternative to the next. So again, this is mostly what the existing alignment looks like. Next. This would be in some sections. This is specifically at the Meadow Charleston area, the trench alternative, where the trains would be put into a 35 to 40 foot, 37 foot trench. And you can see would still have Alma mostly on the east and first and second row homes. Next. This is one of the viaduct configurations. This one at Churchill Ave. This shows the rail line is now elevated up above the existing alignment up to about 20 feet. That would allow crossing streets to pass underneath. And keeping in mind that all of these alternatives we're looking at, one of the primary features is they would eliminate the horn soundings that are now heard many, many times a day throughout the corridor. As trains are required to sound their horns at grade crossings, most of these alternatives are designed to alleviate that at grade crossing, so the horns wouldn't have to be used. So this is the configuration at Churchill. I think the configuration for a couple of the other crossings are similar, but maybe a little bit different in terms of the distances, but pretty much the same configuration. Next. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Could you back up one? This is something that was updated with the assumption that there would be these short parapet barriers on the elevated viaduct. And the idea of behind those is it would help to block the wheel rail noise that was coming from the train vehicles going into the neighborhoods. And also with the assumption that the inside of the barrier there would have some acoustical absorption. So it would not only block the sound going into the neighborhoods, but it would also reduce the vast majority of the sound that might bounce back and then back over the top. So as long as those, I know there was a comment earlier that the noise would just bounce around, the primary design recommendations, you'd have acoustical absorption material on the inside to help eliminate that reflected sound that would end up back into the neighborhoods. Next. This is a depiction of the hybrid, and which is the rail lines would be up on top of a kind of a, not a berm, but a raised earthen platform up to 15 feet high. And at grade crossings, the streets would kind of dip down underneath there. So not a full underpass, but I guess they call it a hybrid. These would also include the 6 foot high barrier walls on the outside. And this is the view at Meadow and Charleston, keeping in mind that not every one of these alternatives would be used at every one of the grade crossings. So the results we'll be looking at later will be representative of the noise reduction for homes in the area of those specific separation alternatives. Next. Here is the underpass at Churchill. So this one would have you'd be converting to the new rail line, and then you'd have an underpass that would primarily eliminate the need for the horn sounding for the most part. Next. And then you have a underpass for Meadow and Charleston, and they're configured a little bit differently because they were at the previous one at Churchill, they would connect up to a part of the Alma Street that would dip down to where the underpass is. This one would be a full underpass that would go all the way and meet up with the road later on. Similar, but just a little bit different in terms of where they come up out of the underpass. Next. Okay, so when the whole idea of the study is we were trying to predict what the difference would be in the sound levels with each one of these different alternatives. And these are just the set of assumptions we used in our model. They had to do with the speed for, we were assuming the freight trains would still be at about 50 miles an hour. Passenger trains would be more like 80. For the train lengths, the big difference here is that while the current trains are locomotive hauled, usually 6 cars, 1 locomotive, the future would be these EMU units. So they're multiple energy units. They have 6 cars, 3 are powered and 3 are unpowered. That's a typo there for 2. 3 plus 3 equals 6. So there'd be 3 powered, 3 unpowered. The freights would remain typically 2 locomotives and 50 cars. We also had assumptions as far as the number of daily trains. Current is 60, supposed to be 60 day plus 12 at night. Future would be increased to 99 during the day and 15 at night. And then both of them would have about 3 freight trains at night. And also the peak hours would be about 16 trains per hour and no freight trains. And then we had assumptions for the peak amount of road traffic, because when we calculated the noise levels, we considered both the rail noise and the roadway noise, primarily for Alma Street. And actually Alma Street makes a pretty good contribution because unlike the train noise, which only happens when a train's going by, the road noise is there all the time since there's almost always traffic on the roadway. And then we had a few assumptions as far as the attenuation for different aspects of the proposal, how many decibel reduction we'd be expecting to getting from first row homes relative to second row homes, what we're getting from the parapet barrier, what we'll be getting from trench sections and tunnel sections, ground type, and also that we're generally ignoring the backyard fences where they exist because there's a lot of variation there. And most of the fences in the area are wooden fences that don't provide much noise reduction anyway. So these are just the assumptions we used in the model. Next. This table just kind of indicates, in the report, we went into a little bit of detail explaining what the different noise sources are in the vicinity of the rail line. And there's 4 primary noise sources. There's the horns and bells that are associated with grade crossings, the horns that are currently mounted up on top of the locomotive, and bells that are at the grade crossing themselves. So those make a significant amount of noise. And in most cases, that's the dominant noise source because those horns are very loud. Wheel rail noise, that's the interaction of the steel wheels on the steel rail, which produces noise. Engine noise, which is associated with locomotives, not so much for the EMU cars because their motors are lower and distributed across several cars. And also, as I mentioned, we're considering the road noise as well. So if you look at the different alternatives here, existing switch to EMU trains from the current locomotives, roadway grade crossing closure in one area, trench, viaduct, hybrid, tunnel, both passenger plus freight, and the different alternatives have the freight remain above ground, and underpass. And this just accounts for example, for the EMU trains. They're going to help reduce the engine noise because they don't have a locomotive. They have these distributed electric motors, which are much quieter. But that wouldn't have anything, that would not affect the horns or the wheel rail noise or the road noise. Those will all remain the same. But if you look at, for example, the hybrid, that would eliminate grade crossing. So it would eliminate the horn sounding. It would have those parapet walls, which would help reduce the wheel rail noise. It, again, has the same electric motors as the EMU, so it would reduce the engine noise. And in most cases, because the hybrid includes a solid fill and material there, it would reduce road noise in some locations. So clearly some of the alternatives may have no change in any of these, and some would change 2 or 3 or maybe even all 4 of them. Next. Just real quickly about the metrics used in some of the tables here. We display the predicted levels for peak hour, and that would be averaged over the hour that has the most train activity during that hour. And then another metric, which is what FTA and FRA actually use to assess impacts, is what's called the day-night noise level. And that's really an average of the noise over 24 hours with a penalty thrown in, a 10 dB penalty for noise that happens at night, since people tend to be more sensitive to noise between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. And for the tables we're going to present, we present results for first row and second row homes on both the west side and the east side. And those are very generalized. We didn't do on a per property basis, but we try to generalize according to whether they're first, second row, and on which side. And they generally vary between the west side and the east side, because on the west side, the train is generally closer, and on the east side, the road is closer. And again, the road produces noise all day long, every hour of the day. And the other side, the train noise is a little bit more sporadic. So there's a difference between east side and west side. Next. All right, so here's our analysis here. So what we're showing is we're showing all the different kind of alternatives, which are from existing with horns for the diesel trains and with existing with horns for the new EMU trains. Now, there's not a lot of difference here. That's not because the EMU trains are not quieter, they are, but the big difference is that you're still sounding the horns here, and the horns are the dominant source when they're used. But once you close the, get away from there, there's a bigger difference between diesel and EMU trains when you take away the horn sounding. Then we have predicted noise levels for the viaduct at the Churchill crossing and the viaduct for the Meadow and Christian crossing. And again, these are just the raw numbers. And for each one of these four positions, we have the number for the peak hour and for the day-night noise level. For trench, for the transition between a trench and a tunnel, a passenger tunnel and freight tunnel, there's actually two different tunnel alternatives. One have both the passenger train and the freight in the tunnel, and one of them has just the passenger in the tunnel, and the freight still operates above ground. Then we have actually it looks like 4 underpass alternatives, one for underpass at Meadow Charleston, one for the underpass at there with a barrier, with a wayside barrier, one underground at at Churchill, and one at Churchill with a wayside barrier. And then we had just a few differences there, that the existing versus closure for diesel, it shows you the difference in decibels between the two. So that is really that line there you're seeing, that's the effect of just eliminating basically the horn noise. That makes about 12 to 13 decibel difference in general. Existing versus closure for the EMU, it's a little bit better, but not a lot, because it's really all about the horns when you're near a grade crossing. And then just the difference between the EMU and the diesel, and you see those generally make about the difference between the two different train types are less than about 1 decibel. Next. So this is the relative difference. The slide before was the actual noise level. This is the difference when compared to the existing condition. So you can see for each one of these, and you kind of have to look at in both directions to see what the relative benefit of each one of these alternatives varies by the position. First row west, first row east, second row west, second row east. But if you look at just, for example, the first row to the west, you can see that some of these work better than others. And the overall, the locations where the tunnel is at grade freight would give you about almost a 22 decibel reduction at the first row on the west side, and lower at the first row on the east side. Part of that is because with the freight at grade, that will actually reduce the amount of lanes on Alma Road from 4 to 2. And the freight trains happen fairly infrequently, only 3 times a night. But once you reduce the number of lanes on Alma Road, the contribution from the roadway is significantly reduced. So that actually comes into play and makes this one of the better alternatives, strictly from a noise standpoint. That would also make traffic worse, by the way, because you're eliminating half the travel lanes on Alma. Next. So takeaways from the noise report: biggest reduction comes from eliminating the sound horning. That's a big difference. It's 9 to 14 decibels. Everything else we're talking about is relatively minor compared to these. So the main objective that all these have in common is get rid of the horn soundings. And I'm sure you people, especially the folks who are anywhere near the grade crossings, know that those horns will knock you right out of bed. Everything else is secondary to the horn sounding from a noise standpoint. Viaduct and hybrid alternatives will provide additional benefit by reducing. Now there's a graphic kind of in the way there. Move that out of the way. Some additional benefit by reducing the wheel rail noise for all receivers using those short barriers, parapet barriers. The hybrid alternative will also help for Alma Street, because The receivers on the west side will have a line of sight break between their backyards and the traffic on Alma. So that will help a little bit with the roadway noise in addition to whatever it does in reducing the train noise. The trench and tunnel alternatives both provide significant reductions for engine and wheel rail noise. Probably also the most costly one, but again, we're just looking at noise and vibration here. And the tunnel at grade with freight would provide additional overall reduction because, as I just mentioned, it'll help reduce the noise from Alma Street because it reduces the capacity of Alma Street from 4 lanes to 2. Next. So now we look at vibration. It's not going to be as much of a change in vibration. Like we said, with the noise, the 800-pound gorilla is the horn sounding at the grade crossing. So with the vibration, it has more to do with whether or not the alternative would move the vibration, the source of vibration closer or further from the homes. And here, like the elevated portions tend to be better because the vibration will be reduced as it goes through the viaduct structure or the hybrid berm structure. So for the grade crossing closures, that have no difference in terms of vibration. The Churchill Viaduct would have a significant reduction because the viaduct structure would reduce the vibration that goes into the ground and up into the homes. The Meadow and Charleston would also have a significant reduction, maybe slightly better for the west and the east side because it's closer to the west side. The hybrid would also have a slight reduction for the homes on both the east and the west. It wouldn't have as much of a vibration reduction as the viaduct structure. Trench would have maybe a slight reduction just because it increases the path between the homes and the track bed. Freight and tunnel would probably a slight reduction for homes on both the east and the west, but it wouldn't change the vibration from the freight at all for the freight at grade. So that'd still be a slight reduction. And for the underpass, it would be little or no change in the vibration. So the takeaway for vibration is that you get a pretty good reduction for the elevated options as opposed to the at grade or tunnel options. All right, next. This is just a little background on vibration. There's two things that vibration can typically do with elevated vibration. If they're very high, they could potentially cause some damage to structures, but they have to be really, really high to do that. And even then, most of the damage you're talking about would be like cracking the plaster occasionally. And if you don't already have that going on, I don't think anything going on here would increase it. At a lower level than that, you may be feel the vibration and be annoyed by the vibration. And I would guess that some people who are on the first row, especially on the west side, probably already feel the trains as they're going by. So I don't think any of the alternatives here would make it any worse, but some of them would help reduce it. Again, in particular, the ones that had the elevated structures. Next. So the takeaways that we had here is the viaduct and hybrid alternatives would provide some additional benefits in terms of reducing some of the wheel rail noise. Most of the proposed alternatives would either create no significant change or perhaps a slight improvement in vibration. Viaduct alternatives may produce a significant improvement in terms of vibration in those areas. And only the tunnel at freight alternative would likely increase any of the vibration levels slightly for the homes to the east, where you still have a few nighttime freight trains. Next. So this is about construction noise. They wanted us to look at that as well. We looked at this in really a qualitative sense because there's a lot of variation in terms of what kind of equipment that they would have out there. Some of the alternatives require much more equipment and much more lengthy construction periods than others. So we kind of thought about the type of equipment they would have out there and how long they would have it out there. So for the grade crossing closure, that would have a very much more limited noise and vibration from construction because fairly short duration and wouldn't need a lot of the heavier equipment. Viaduct would be more moderate. It still not the longest duration, but they would have more heavy equipment out there, cranes and excavators and things to cement trucks to pour and form the aerial structures. Hybrid would be moderate to severe. There'd be a lot of trucks removing or bringing in material to build up the hybrid berm structure and so forth. The trench and tunnel would probably be the most severe because they would have a lot of equipment on site, removing a lot of material with heavy trucks, and that would take that would have the longest duration as well. Next. And I think that's it. So there's a lot more information in the report that we filed. But if there's any questions about what we presented here, I'd be glad to try to answer any questions.
And if I can just take a moment to add, obviously this was done, the original study was done when we were still considering the tunnels, which are no longer being considered. And also just want to note, as I mentioned earlier, we're continuing to work on the quiet zones, which will reduce or eliminate the horn noise, which was mentioned.
Yep.
Thanks. So why don't we see if we have members of the public who want to speak, and then we'll come back to the committee.
Our first speaker is Eric Nordman.
Good afternoon. My name is Eric Nordman, and I had a few comments on the noise study. The noise study focused on the average noise. While this is important, equally important is the peak noise that wakes the baby or otherwise disrupts people's lives. With horns and diesel engines removed, the main train noise will be from the wheels. According to the study, parapet sound walls can reduce this noise by 12 decibels. While parapets exist in the hybrid and the viaduct, they are not currently included in the underpass option, but could be. I found it interesting that despite a common perception, the underpass is the worst of the three viable options. In addition to the parapets, the solid embankments of the hybrid blocks road noise, and the viaduct mass reduces ground vibration and it's also shifted eastward. Thank you.
Our next request to speak is Steve Rosenblum.
Good afternoon again. Yeah, I really think this report is extremely thorough and very impressive. I'm far from an expert on issues of noise and vibration, but I think table 5.1, which Mr. Birch showed in the presentation, I think is the thing you need to really concentrate on for the noise issues. And what you see from that table is that the viaduct noise level is the same as the hybrid, and that closure surprisingly has the least noise reduction of all the options, which I was really surprised at. But the third thing I thought was counterintuitive until Mr. Burge explained it was that the tunnel at grade with freight was the best, and that's because of traffic congestion on Alma by reducing the number of lanes from 4 to 2, which seems to me not a sensible kind of idea for noise reduction. I mean, if we got rid of traffic on Alma completely, that would be a great noise solution, right? But it doesn't make any sense. Finally, I think the construction noise also, I think, was very interesting, that the viaduct has the lowest construction noise and the shortest construction time. So I think we're beginning to see that a lot of the public concern about noise during operation and noise during construction of the viaduct is unfounded. It's not based on sound engineering analysis, but on fear, uncertainty, and doubt that's created by people that don't know the facts. So I hope that council members will take this report to heart and really look at the details. And as I say, particularly table 5.1, which I think even to a layperson makes it pretty clear what the noise outcomes of the different options are. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Winter Dellenbach.
Hi, I apologize. I jumped the gun a little bit on even mentioning the noise issue that I mentioned before, but I guess I got overly excited there when I was speaking. So sorry about that, out of order. But back to that for just a second, I did want to clarify that when I talked to the expert, this was the expert that the consultant had. Now, this was a few years ago. Two things. He did, if I didn't make it clear, he was taking into account the sound walls as mitigating the sound, but also bouncing the sound. And here's my query now is he was talking about bouncing the noise further into the neighborhoods than the first row, second row houses. Further than that, and he said he used the term significant. Have it in my notes. And my question is let's see, why wasn't or will there be? Well, I guess there will be done maybe more analysis, but the thinking about the bounce going further than the first or second row of houses, and again the word significant being used. So I didn't see that on the current study, and I'm curious about that. And then lastly, thank you, Committee Member Burt, for the additional information last time about the berm versus with the freight train. And I appreciated being updated about that. So anyway, how much further away would this sound bounce and how significant is it? That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we'll now come back to the committee for questions and comments. Vicki?
Thank you. And thank you for bringing this report back and explaining to us. It's very illuminating and helpful. And I particularly appreciate the diagrams and the slides, very helpful. A couple of questions. The first, I want to thank Mr. Nordman for his public comment, because that was exactly what I'd written down in my notes here was, we're talking about single hour averages and 24-hour averages, but I too am interested in peak noise. And I'm just wondering if there are, I assume nobody likes a particularly loud jarring horn or wheel noise, but are there particular levels above which we think that it is unacceptable, and do any of these reach that? Is that something that Mr. Burge could address?
Am I being directed to respond to the question, or?
Yeah, if you would.
Okay, so I think the question is there a level that would be considered kind of like a red light level that you really just never want to cross over? The reality is that people's response to noise is varies a lot. I mean, you have people who live next door to each other, and I've encountered this many times just doing noise surveys. And some people will say, "Oh, that noise is horrible. I can't sleep. I can't think. I think I'm killing myself. It's the most horrible thing ever." And you go to the guy next door and says, "Oh, I kind of like it." So people's reaction to noise is very hard to calibrate in general terms. I would agree that probably the most jarring, if you were to use the word jarring, portion of your current experience probably has to do with the horns, especially if you live within a quarter mile of those grade crossings where the trains are required to sound their horns. You're maybe sitting at the table and enjoying a nice cup of tea or something like that, and the train just immediately outside of your backyard plays on that horn. Don't blame the engineer. It's a federal law that he has to do it, but yeah, that can knock you right out of your chair or right out of bed. So I would say that even though there's no single recognized limit that they're not supposed to cross, in fact, they're following the law by sounding the horn, but eliminating the need to sound those horns would be the first, second, and third most important thing in terms of reducing the noise in your community. No matter what they do, aside from a tunnel, you're always going to hear when the trains go by. But if you eliminate those, if you do something to eliminate the horn soundings, one of these alternatives, or getting the FRA to buy into a quiet zone or something else, that is by far the best thing that you can do. That would cut down the perceivable noise by a factor of 4, probably. So that would be the biggest thing that you'd notice. All the rest of this stuff, you're talking about, plus or minus a couple dB here or there. But the 800-pound gorilla is getting rid of those horn soundings, especially for people who live near the grade crossings. I hope that helped with your question.
That's very helpful. But I think perhaps another way to ask it, or to delve more deeply into the peak noise issue, is you just mentioned that it's the horn noise by far is the most. It would be interesting though, because for ones for which that's a constant, to know what proportion is it, the 90%, is it 50%? In other words, so relative one to another, what the different peak noises are, because for ones that still have the train horn, or for ones that don't, it's going to be that other components of the noise that would make a difference. And I'm, if it's completely negligible, option to option, that would be nice to know. And if it's not, that would be nice to know.
Well, I want to clarify in those tables that show both the LDN, which is the 24-hour average with a nighttime penalty, as opposed to the peak hour. That's the average noise over the hour that has the most train activity. It's not the peak second of a train pass by or anything like that.
I understand that. That's why I'm asking the question.
So are you saying we're missing by not including the kind of the instantaneous peak?
Yeah, I'm curious as to whether or not we are. You might have an average over in an hour, even at peak time, that's acceptable, and there could conceivably be an option that it might have an hour average that's acceptable, but the instant, the per instance noise is unacceptable, and that's what I'm trying to understand.
Like maybe the loudest second or something like that.
During the interval when the train is passing, whatever that noise level is, as opposed to the many intervals when the train is not passing.
Right.
Yes,
right.
That's what I'm curious about.
Okay.
The absolute noise at that time.
Right. There's probably a dozen or more metrics we could have used. LDN, you say, what is the actual limit? LDN is the limit that FTA and FRA actually use for their impact criterion. That is, you're doing a study that's compliant with the FTA or FIRA guidance on this, which is the federal guidance. They quantify whether you're impacted according to what the LDN level is.
And that's a 24-hour average, right?
24-hour average with the nighttime penalty.
Yep.
There's other ways. Another metric is called the SCL, or the single event level. And what that does is that kind of collapses all the noise from a single event down to a 1 second period, how much acoustical energy would be in that relative 1 second. And that's one way that you can use to at least compare different sound sources to how much acoustical energy they generate over the period of a single event. And that event could be, a few seconds for a train pass by. It may be a few minutes for a freight train pass by. As you know, that freight train may not make as much sudden noise, but the fact that it lasts much longer than a passenger train, it may end up having a higher dose of noise for a single event. So that's one way you might look at those. But but in picking one metric to quantify whether noise constitutes an impact, a severe impact or a moderate impact, according to the federal government, is that LDN metric.
Right. So you've given me the term I was looking for, single event level.
Yeah.
And so all I'm saying is, and we don't have that in this study, correct? The single event levels?
Right. That's not one that you usually use in reporting impacts. That's something we use more we do use that in this analysis, but that's more for the modeling purpose. That's a little harder for laypersons to kind of internalize that. So it's not one of the ones that usually shows up in the reports very much, but that was a metric that was used in some of the calculations.
Yeah, and no, I'm sure it's compliant and it's excellent insofar as it goes. I'm just trying to understand how far it goes. And so what we've got, I think, is we've got our 24 average with the nighttime discount. We've got our 1 hour average, and we don't have our SELs, which perhaps some residents might care about, or perhaps it's not relevant if the differences between SELs between the options aren't very big, but we just don't know. That is what I think is the takeaway. Is that fair?
Well, I think maybe the one thing, there is a metric called the LMAX, and that is the absolute maximum level over the course of an event. And that's usually measured like in the loudest 1 second, or maybe even the loudest eighth of a second, depending on the setting. You might look at that, but that discounts how long it lasts. You might say, look at two events. So this one has a LMAX of 100 dB and this one has an LMAX of 90 dB. Obviously the LMAX of 100 dB is louder. Well, maybe it lasts a second, and the one that's 90 dB lasts for an entire hour. So that's a very narrow slice of describing the noise associated with a particular event. It just looks at the loudest individual peak and ignores the duration.
Okay. And I'm not necessarily seeking additional measures. I was just trying to understand the single event issue. And then my other question is, This was done 3 years ago. Are there any reasons that any of this would change? A couple that I could think of is perhaps the sound insulation on the parapet technology has changed. Chair Burt just mentioned that perhaps with the hybrid, it could be not a berm, you know, things like that. Are there any things that if we were to do it today might look a little different?
Well, if any of the assumptions that we use, and one of the slide does go over the assumptions, and the report goes into over more detail, and we assume train speeds and number of trains and you know, the expected noise reduction for things like parapet walls and the tunnel trench structures and so forth. If there was any major changes in any of the design or operations information that we use in our assumptions, including the traffic on Alma, because, and I wanted to reinforce it, the traffic on Alma counts because that is happening all the time. The train noise only happens when there's a train there, which is, you know, up to maybe just 16 times per hour. There's traffic from Alma every minute of every hour. So in the LDN, that adds up and it has an effect. So the answer to your question is, if anything significant has changed in what that will affect our assumptions, it might change the results of the study somewhat.
Sure. I think maybe the question would have been better put to Director Kami, because I guess that's what I'm wondering. Are there anything you're aware of that would make this not perhaps as current as we do?
Yeah. Thank you. I think the things that would have changed would be kind of consistent across all of the different alternatives that we mentioned.
Okay.
Different levels of trains occurring would, you know, have an impact. Different traffic on Alma, as an example, might have an impact, but would be kind of consistent across the different alternatives.
Okay, that's helpful. And I'll wrap up because I've been going a while, but it also seems that when you think of signal to noise ratio, or you think of a flat thing and what the deltas are, that traffic on Alma, while a significant source of noise over the course of an hour or 24 hours or whatever, during those intervals where you have those SELs, the events, I mean, that is there. I mean, what we control is the train noise, and I don't think we have a separate measure of just the train noise, right? This all incorporates the traffic. And I realize the traffic's a little different depending on the different choices and where it goes, and, you know, if we have the street closure versus others, but it seems like there's going to be some steady, constant traffic that factors significantly into the noise level, and yet that's not really what we're changing by these decisions. Do you grasp what I'm not articulating it very well, but
yeah, so that's largely correct. The roadway noise is going to be there. We're not necessarily making plans to change the roadway noise.
So my fear is that it would mask or dwarf or somehow diminish the distinctions between the noise levels of the different train alternatives. That's my concern.
Yeah, but I was going to say there is an exception to that. I believe that some of the alternatives, like the hybrid, does actually reduce some of the roadway noise. So just mentioning that I think the hybrid, potentially the underpass, the underpass as well, reduces some of that roadway noise. So there are some alternatives that impact the roadway noise, but that's why they're kind of considered separately.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Ed?
Yeah, that's all very, very helpful. And while I was reading the reports and listening to the presentation, my kind of guidance was, you know, how will we weight this in the decision on the preferred alternative? But almost more importantly, how are we going to weight this in terms of how we explain to all the residents, you know, what's important and what's not, because everyone hates noise. We know that. And we could see that in a variety of areas, somebody could say it's really too noisy here. And I would expect that from pretty much everywhere. But what I'm learning in spades, that it's at least 4x of the problem is the horns. And, you know, we can fix that in completely different ways. And we're looking at all that right now, which means we're hopefully right on target with that kind of analysis. And that's really helpful. I also really appreciated the comment that in this context, I wasn't considering, but it's true, where everybody's perception of noise is different. I live by the community center relatively near Chair Burt, and I hear the horn at night. And I get up in the morning, I say, God, I couldn't sleep. Could you imagine that? Did you hear that horn all night? And my wife goes, no, I didn't hear a thing. Ditto the garbage trucks that are outside the front door on Mondays, and I'm sticking in earplugs and she has the window open. So that's really actually instructive, I think, is that when we get various comments from people, if it's too noisy, the spouse in the same house might have a different perspective. So I just really hadn't sort of calculate that in my own evaluation here as we look at this going forward. I got a little concerned. It's been clarified by answers to Vicky's questions, but I got a little bit concerned about looking at average noise levels because, medians would be better and peaks would be better. So I'm more in line here with what you're talking about. And then the duration of the peak noise, I think is what I was thinking about during some of the conversations as well. Because if it's an occasional boom, that's one thing, but if it's long freight trains, that's kind of another thing. But I just found that it was really helpful in sort of trying to balance this out, and even to the extent that maybe the issue of noise versus a lot of other things, like certainly safety, isn't our highest criteria here, because we're going to be helped in so many ways. So, I was very, very helpful in terms of kind of weighting these things where we're heading.
I think this is an important reminder that, the quiet zone work that we're doing, how critical it is to the noise impacts. So just, internalizing that as well. This is, it's really critical, the work that we're doing regarding the quiet zones.
Yeah, that your last point just was really driven home by the data. First that we see that we will have noise reductions from whichever alternative we choose, but the biggest reduction will be from getting rid of horns, and we might get rid of them before we have a grade separation. The issue of the varying perceptions on noise, and I'll add that we not only have different individuals who have greater and lesser sensitivity to noise, but we have this phenomena that's kind of the don't think of an elephant phenomena. Once you start thinking about the noise, you hear it obsessively. Speaking of spouses, when a number of years ago, my wife, as we were dealing with the airplane noise, she started kind of counting and listening to the airplanes, and it got so unbearable to her. She heard every airplane and it was so loud, and she had to stop monitoring, and she really had a diminishment in what she perceived. And I think that's just a human reality, and something that we have to recognize. And I did want to just bring up one point on the construction noise, which is, all the construction impacts we tend to diminish, where we say, oh, this is all about what will happen after we've done construction. But we can have several years of construction on a series of grade separations. That is a massive impact. And the underpass was evaluated with conventional construction methods and not jackbox. And this is one of the things where we have seen that Caltrain is looking at that, but they basically, Caltrain and VTA have both said, no, that's a well-established construction method. And in VTA's circumstance, they've used it under other roadway construction in the county. The team at Caltrain that is now leading this says, oh yeah, it's a very favorable construction method, and it can drastically reduce the construction impact, and including some of the most severe construction periods. And so we'll want to kind of recalibrate those construction periods, and therefore even construction noise impacts, once we get affirmation from Caltrain officially that jackbox an acceptable method. Now, that doesn't mean Jackbox is going to be feasible at every location. You know, where you have a tight circumstance like Churchill, I just don't know from an engineering standpoint whether you can fit in a Jackbox construction there because of just the physical constraints of the narrower Alma there and narrower Caltrain right away. It's a tighter place to do construction. I did want to just point out freight will continue to have heavy cars, but it's only about 3% of the trains apparently. It said 3 per night. I thought it was a little more, but anyway, it's still very few. But they're noisy. They're the noisiest trains we have, and currently they have horns as well. But just the train itself, we won't get the same reduction that we get from an electrified train from the reduced engine noise. But the biggest reduction again will be from the horns. And then I did want to ask about this question on noise impacts beyond the second row. Do we have, and maybe even if we didn't study it, Paul, do you have any insights on that? And it's really going to be a question in my mind whether this might be something that we want to add as an addendum to the noise study if it's feasible. Paul, do you have any insights on what we might be facing on noise impacts beyond the second row?
Yeah, and as the one member had pointed out, I was probably the person you were talking to at that meeting. I was the noise guy there. So I think what I probably would have told you if I at least were going back, 3-4 years ago. But I think the point that I was making is that by raising the noise source up by 20 feet, something like that, what happens is a lot of the noise would have been blocked by the first row of homes and not continuing unabated to the second and third row of homes. If you raise it up by 20 or 25 feet, some of that noise is going to go over the top of the front row homes, and that is what would cast some of that noise into second and third row homes that wouldn't have been there before because the first row would have blocked them. But that's in a case where you don't have any sort of a parapet barrier there. And I think we even looked at that initially and saw that could be a problem. And that I'm trying to remember correctly. I'm not sure that the parapet barriers were originally part of the design. And they said, oh yeah, we can put those on, no problem. And so once we put them on, the assumption is, and again, most of the time when you put on a parapet barrier for a rail, elevated rail structure like that, you do have it designed to be acoustically absorptive on the inside. And that would very much limit not only the line of sight between the wheel rail noise and the first, second, third, and further out, but also that acoustical absorption would prevent the vast majority of the acoustical energy from bouncing off the inside of the parapet, back off the solid body of the train, and then back out into the neighborhood. So when properly designed, you can negate the effect of the noise source being up higher in the air with the fact that noise is being effectively captured by the parapet barrier. So I would say that the effect on the community further into the distance beyond the first row would be mitigated by having properly designed parapet barriers. I'm not trying to extinguish any concern about that, because if they had gaps in the barriers or gap underneath the barrier, if they're not properly designed, if they didn't have proper acoustical absorption, it could be a problem. So you have to make sure they're properly designed and specified to have that acoustical absorption, and that should resolve most of that problem.
Thank you. That's real helpful.
Okay.
Yep. And I do share concerns about this single event level or even the LMAX that now granted again that the biggest single event is a freight train blasting a night horn. And so if we get rid of the night horn, we've really diminished that single event level.
Well, do keep in mind that all the trains will have horns, but whether it's one of these alternatives or an FRA approved quiet zone, they don't have to sound them. And that is true for both the passenger trains and the freight trains as well. So the peak level for any of those would be the whole sound of the train going by, not just that spike when the 4 seconds when they're sounding their horn according to the required sequence that they sound. So that would be taken away regardless of, just want to make sure everybody understands that would apply to the quiet zone, would apply to freight trains as well.
Okay. And this is a minor thing, but I did notice you had down, I think, 50 cars for the freight. I'm not sure that we have freight trains that have that number of cars, but we can double check with Caltrain and they can provide that for us. But I don't think
that was an assumption. I'm sure some trains have more or less, but that's the assumption we were told to work with about how many typically they would have. So
yeah, but on this short haul line that we have here, I think there's not more. I think it's less. But I'll defer to what we can ask Caltrain, and they can simply confirm that. And it's not, that's on the margins. Okay. So, yeah, Vicky, did you have something?
Yeah. So, this study is terrifically detailed, lots of excellent data. I'm sure it was well managed study, well constructed. I am concerned though about its utility for us, how helpful it is if we're really trying to address the real impact upon our residents of sound. I do think not having single event data is a real hindrance. Because we just don't know. And most of the time there's not a train there, and we're in charge of the times when there is, and we don't know anything about the absolute nature of that number. So that's troubling to me. Secondly, I also note the public commenter who mentioned the importance of table 5-1, which I agree with, because it's the sources of the noise by alternatives. The problem is there's no numeric or quantitative breakdown. It's just a qualitative, no change or reduction. And so we don't know if we were to remove the horns, what percentage. We're told it's a high percentage, but the different pieces. It would be really helpful if we knew the components, the degree, the percentage that is attributable to each source of the noise per alternative. Because for example, with the horns, for every single one listed there, there's reduction. So it's kind of it's not a helpful thing to decide as a decision basis, especially given the fact that we hopefully will make good progress on these quiet zones. And I should have mentioned with the single event thing, the reason the average also concerns me is you can radically shift it by having more or less trains per hour. So this whole ridership thing and how many trains go, that's going to affect your average over an hour or a peak or over 24 hours, as opposed to the volume of a given train, unless you averaged it out per a certain, a common number. So I'm just kind of stuck on that, obviously. So those are my thoughts. So I guess what I'm saying is it's really helpful to think through this. It's good to learn, that the horns are a big degree, but I think further down the tracks, as we get closer to choosing, if we think noise is not just a subjective thing, but something we really ought to consider, I guess some of those things I've asked about, I would find very helpful to know.
Well, if I could say that table 5-1, that was meant to be qualitative. I mean, we were trying to demonstrate that some of these options affect some of the noise sources and not others. And we wanted to have a table that was not loaded with numbers, but the tables that follow on do give the quantitative aspect of what the actual numbers are for each one of those scenarios.
So help me understand that. I mean, clearly that one's qualitative and intended to be, and I appreciate that because that's useful as well. But I see peak and LDNs in the following tables, but I don't see percentages attributable to horns versus wheels versus engines versus road. Am I missing that? And I may very well be.
Well, I mean, some of it's in the detail there. You can see with existing horns, and you can compare. I think I even have.
I'm sorry, could you tell me which slide you're looking at?
Okay, if you look at table 5.3, for example.
5.3. Okay, just a moment. I'd like to do that.
5.3. She's referring to the report, not to the presentation.
Oh, I was referring to the presentation, but I'm happy to go to the report.
Well, I don't think there is a, okay, well, maybe, is it in the presentation?
I'll look wherever you'd like for
I
me
think
to
it
look.
was in the presentation as well.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, 5.1. Okay, so if you go down to the table number isn't given here, but it's slide 11.
It's slide 11. Yes, thank you. I'm looking at slide 11.
So I believe that here, if you look down at the bottom, existing versus closure for the EMU, that's basically the only difference there is the horns. So this is telling you for each of those measurement positions what the difference is with horns and without horns, and that basically is the only difference. So that's kind of the difference between the two in terms of decibels. So sometimes it's kind of buried in the data there a little bit, but up here, all the lines here give you the predicted number for the different alternatives and locations. And down at the bottom, I did try to kind of, so one of them is the difference between horns and no horns for diesel, and for the EMU, and for the EMU versus diesel, like to demonstrate that the new electric trains and the diesel, really, there's not a big difference there, less than a decibel in terms of most of these calculated values. But kind of at the bottom part of that like existing versus closure for diesel, that tells you the difference in the horn sounding, the difference in the sound level for peak and LDN, just eliminating the horns.
Paul, can I just follow up with a question? I think what you were explaining is the single event feeds into this information that you have for the LDN. Is that correct?
No, we didn't. No, all the calculated data here is for the peak hour, which is the average over the hour would have the most train activity, which I believe is 16 trains per hour, and the LDN, which is the 24-hour average with the nighttime penalty. And the LDN is the official federal metric that the federal government looks at in determining impacts. So, we didn't want to make this too complicated. If you look at like the peak, the individual instantaneous peak for each event, it may not be a lot different because mostly it would be associated with the horn, since that's always the loudest thing. If the horns, if you're still sounding the horn, but the duration, does matter. It does show up in these numbers, but we did not include the individual event peak for each event.
Okay.
At least in the presentation of the data.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And then to go into further detail on that, the single events, is that something that could be shared? And if so, would that or would that not be helpful?
Well, as I said, that discounts the duration of an event, and that matters in terms of people's annoyance to something. If something is lasts for 5 seconds, it's a certain level of annoying. If it lasts for 5 hours, it's a much different picture. So just presenting the maximum instantaneous level does not tell a very significant part of the story. And I'm not trying to argue in favor or against any one of these particular alternatives. I just think that the too much different metrics tends to make things more confusing. We could, if we were asked to go back and present a peak sound level for each event, we could do that. I'm just not, and if we were asked to do so, we could. I'm not sure that would help a lot, but maybe that's not for me to say.
Let me ask the question differently, because I think do you, when you measure, you just measure all sound? So you don't have the data for what proportions are from wheels versus engine versus horn versus traffic. Is that right?
I mean, if you actually do a live noise measurement in the field?
Well, I don't know how you do your measurements, but however you do your measurements, do you have the data for the different component sources or not?
Okay, well, the tables here are not based on measurements. These are predicted. So, but when you do the prediction, yes, you do. Right, you do consider different inputs for different. There's a contribution from wheel rail noise. There's a contribution from the engine noise. There's a contribution
That's what I'm
from the
looking
horn
for.
noise. Yeah.
That's what it is. So is there a place where we have the different contribution of the different sources to the model that produces the numbers in the charts in the document?
Yeah, that might even be in the report, actually.
Great. That's what I'd love to know.
All right. I would have to get back to you on those
Okay.
on the details.
Fabulous. I think that would be helpful in understanding the different alternatives. All right, thank you.
I'll just add something that I realized in the earlier when I was talking about the good news on the new service level that Caltrain is planning, which is basically their effort to adapt to changing uses and for the train system, and Caltrain is having fewer trains at the peak hour, but they're having more service all the way up into the night. And we hadn't factored that in because we currently don't have nighttime passenger trains. And so that's a downside to that longer service. And I think we may want to include that and look at that. Once again, once we get rid of the horns, that's less of an impact. And so I do share Vicky's question on wanting to break down those different aspects, and maybe it is there's a bunch of data at the attachment A and to the report, and maybe it's in there somewhere. But I think we'll want to understand that better on just looking at the which aspect is contributing the most, or contributing how much quantitatively in each circumstance. And then this last issue of the single event level, I lean toward wanting to see that data as well. So I guess, Philip, if we want to have a bit more study on this, that might be part of what was actually item number 1 today, agenda item number 1. Can we go ahead and ask for some additional data?
Yeah, well, why don't I first look and see if that data already exists, because it sounds like that data already exists. I do want to note, I looked into the final in the report, starts on page 34 and the existing conditions that has the separation for the the wheel noise and the diesel noise and the horn noise. And
is that packet?
It's not in the it is in the packet, but it's the attachment.
Oh, I see. It's
which
page
is
34 under the lower right is a comms numbers, right? 33. No.
45.
Yeah,
that's that appendix B. Yeah.
yes, that's right. Appendix B, noise prediction tables. It's in that section.
Got it.
That does have this separation. I'll follow up with, unless you know right now, is that single event?
Well, I'm looking at that. This is on page, I'm looking at the PDF of the report. And keep in mind, I did this 3.5 years ago. So sorry, do you hear me? Am I still muted?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm looking at page 35 out of 43 of the report. And for existing conditions, for example, it has under rail sources, it has for the diesel locomotive, the SEL and the LMAX. So that's the maximum noise level for that component, and the SEL for that component. So it gives the relative SEL for the diesel horn, the diesel locomotive, and the cars, the individual cars, and the horn. So you can see that the SEL for the diesel locomotive is, if I'm reading this correctly, 92. The SEL for the individual cars is 82. And the SEL for the horn is 110. And these
So,
values
that's-
generally come from the FTA guidance manual.
Okay, so that's great. We have the data. We just maybe want to do some slides going forward so everybody gets to see it in a clear, simple way. That's really great.
Well, I would say that showing these slides is not the clear and simple explanation, but that's I'm sorry. This is how the sausage is made, as they say.
Yeah. And so that kind of goes into the other aspect of all right, now everybody in this meeting has a better understanding, or at least most of us have a better understanding. Maybe some people already knew this stuff. How do we, think about how we communicate this, at least to folks who have been engaged, as well as when we come back to the council, we're finding some real important takeaways, and how do we boil it down to for folks who don't want to go into as detailed of a discussion as we had today, but want to understand the bottom line. Biggest bottom line is it's the horns. Second one is that under all of our alternatives, noise goes down. Those are big takeaways. And then we have some others that are important as well that we'd want to get across. So maybe we'll just kick it back and let staff think about how to communicate that and where to communicate it.
Yeah, thank you. I think probably as we consider the evaluation criteria and all the matrices to figure out how to fit that all in there. But just noting for now, I think that the initial figure that Paul had referenced, the first one in the slide with the green reduced and that, I think that's kind of like the high level thing that we're talking about here. But yeah, condensing that and conveying the message is really critical.
Great. Yeah.
Or a starting point, at least for council, is you could just report out from this meeting at the next council meeting saying, guess what we learned.
Yeah. Although
that doesn't get out to the community at large.
Yeah, and the verbal versus kind of a good simple table, or I think would have a bigger impact.
Yeah, I think there's value, especially as the alternatives are deliberated, in presenting all of the different things together.
Well, Ed's point, we've talked about committees doing report outs in council comments. And we don't want to get into council meetings where we have real long reports, but maybe in this one, maybe we do want a couple of slides that we can throw up on the screen and have both the public and the rest of the council get it. And we kind of recalibrate our thinking on that basis. So maybe in this circumstance, it would be worth it to that.
Well, and I don't want to speak for the city attorney on this, but at some point you'll want to agendize that. Certainly if there's any expectation that members of the public would have the opportunity to speak and basically be heard on the topic. So that's the balance there versus, your normal council member comments, which are impromptu. There's really no exchange, further discussion. A simple report out from the community or from the committee could be agendized.
Okay, well, let's follow up on what would be the best course of action then.
Yeah. And might I say that, Philip, thank you very much for finding page 45. That's exactly what I was looking for. And I do agree that the reporting out should be at the higher level of the qualitative chart for now. But I would love for this committee to keep drilling down on the numbers. I think it's essential. I mean, I'm looking here on this page, and the commuter rail source has the exact same numbers as the freight rail source. That's surprising to me, but that's what we've got. So that's an interesting thing. We know the horns are the biggest, but yet it's not even half of the total by this. If they've got the locomotive at 92 and the cars at 82 and the horns at 110, 110 is a lot bigger than 92. But when you add those three up, it's
okay. Those are logarithmic numbers, so you don't add those
and that's helpful too. But that's exactly what I would like to understand, so we could get to some intermediate thing perhaps between this chart and the qualitative that shows us what percentage is coming from each source. That would be very helpful, because if for some reason 92, 82, 110 I guess because it's decibels, it's logarithmic, but it would be helpful then to translate that to
Yeah,
percentage.
each 10 dB difference is the source is 10 times louder.
Okay, great. So let's translate that to percentages. Thank you.
And I realized I have one more question for Paul. You had emphasized the value of the noise absorbing parapets when they're designed properly. The noise analysis that we have, does that assume those parapets in the on the design alternatives where they would be used?
Yes, that assumes, and I think that's in the report. I'm not sure it showed up in the presentation here, but there was an assumption in that 12 decibel reduction that they would be acoustically absorptive on the side that faces the train.
Good, thank you. Okay, anything else? I think this has been real informative. And Philip, do you have enough feedback and we're all good? Or more than enough?
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah. Good. All right. So I think that concludes the study session. And that leaves us with next future meetings and agendas. And I'm guessing that we're hoping the next meeting, we're going to have a Caltrain report on at least some of our questions, at least the 4-track. I know they wanted to go to, I think they wanted to go to the board first.
Yeah, possibly we might have that. That's still to be determined. Do want to note that we need to publish our items fairly soon. And so it's unlikely that we're going to have anything from Caltrain ahead of time unless it's like a verbal update for the meeting.
Okay, well, maybe we can check in with them on really, right? Tell them that we've got our October meeting. We had their prior commitment. We're really hoping they're going to give us what we're looking for.
Yep.
Do we know what is on there for sure or not yet? The agenda for October?
No, so I don't currently have any items planned for the October meeting.
Okay, well, we can brainstorm on that in the next week. See if there's anything. All righty. On that note, we're adjourned. Thank you.